people want to just give a quick introduction into the chat box so that they can kind of see who's in the room, and feel free to look at the participants as well and you'll be able to see who's here. So I think we've got a few more people that we're waiting on, so I'm just going to give it a minute or so for everyone to join. I'm going to get started now then. I think we've got most people. We're expecting maybe a couple more just waiting to join. So if everyone can just mute for the time being, keep your screens off. I'm going to do the first kind of 15 minutes or so of just talking through some of the work that CDC have been doing around short breaks and the coronavirus, some of the national kind of perspective, and then we'll have some time in the second half of the session for all of you to kind of ask questions, share your thoughts and experiences of everything that's been going on locally, so that we can hopefully think about how we can contribute all of these things in terms of moving things forward for kind of the summer holiday, which obviously has been raised throughout the session as something that everyone's quite concerned and anxious that we need to be planning next step for. So hopefully this session will be able to help with some of that. Okay. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Caroline Cody. I'm the Assistant Director for Social Care at the Council for Disabled Children. And really, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been working really closely with the department to understand the impact on access to short breaks for the children and young people that we're supporting. So we've talked a lot today already, and obviously you're all very, very aware of the changes around the SEND regulations and the timelines. We've heard from Andre, we've heard from Lorraine and Nick about all of those kind of aspects and the impact that they're having on practice. And what I wanted to flag in this session was actually the kind of overlap and the interaction with the changes to regulations in relation to social care. So these came about through the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendment Regulations 2020. So they came into force on the 24th of April. It amends 10 existing pieces of regulation and expires on the 25th of September at this time, but may be renewed. And the significant changes, now these aren't only specific to short breaks, this is across the whole of social care, but I thought it was useful to have a bit of context here. So the significant changes include relaxing the duty to visit looked after children, which can now be conducted by phone or video where you're unable to visit within timescale. So this is really related to social workers' engagement with looked after children, and can be now as soon as is reasonably practicable. 6 monthly care plan reviews can now be held where reasonably practicable. Disabled children taking short breaks for more than 17 days no longer becomes looked after, but for 75 days in a year, that the short break rule in relation to looked after status still applies. Temporary foster placements can now be up to 24 weeks and no longer need to be with someone connected to the child. Initial visits to private foster placements now only need to be as soon as is reasonably practicable. Children in children's homes can be deprived of their liberty in accordance with powers in Schedule 21 of the Coronavirus Act in very specific circumstances where there's a risk of infection. And there are relaxations around holding both fostering and adoption panels. So across the sector, really, in the context of all children and young people who are vulnerable in the context of social care, there have been a number of challenges around how to ensure that children are still safeguarded at a time when potentially there are less checks and measures in place because they're not engaged with school necessarily in the same way that they may have been previously, and how to ensure that those opportunities to intervene appropriately and provide support as necessary there for all children and young people. There's also updated guidance for children's social care services, which was updated on the 6th of May and is still under review, and it remains in place only for as long as is needed. It doesn't amend primary legislation or working together, but it does provide guidance on the adoption and children coronavirus amendment regulations that we were just talking about. So I guess the key things to note from the guidance are that the majority of statutory duties remain the same, that the amended powers should only be used where it's absolutely necessary with senior management oversight and where it's in line with safeguarding and welfare duties. There's an acceptance that face-to-face contact may be replaced by phone or video calls, but inevitably that has its own challenges. It prioritises local decision making, so including where visits may need to be held virtually or postponed. It provides information on circumstances where PPE should be used, confirms child protection conferences should continue to go ahead even if they're held virtually rather than being postponed. The Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel should still be notified of serious incidents within 5 working days. The 15-day rapid review of serious incidents should still be a target, but understanding that the current circumstances may make this more difficult. That court-directed contact arrangements should continue, but where face-to-face contact is not possible should be virtual. And it provides further detail on issues for staffing in children's homes, issues around foster carers becoming unwell, and adoption panels, amongst other topics. Now, although some of these feel like they aren't necessarily specific to children with SEN disabilities. However, there are a lot of overlapping issues there around relaxations of duties, worries about safeguarding, and specifically thinking about support for disabled children and young people in the context of short breaks now. So we're going to go on to think about what some of those regulations and changes mean and the overlap between the SEND changes in the context of short breaks. So some of the challenges that have been raised to us recently is that there was some quite clear guidance at the beginning around supporting vulnerable children and young people during the coronavirus. So the actions for educational providers and other partners, which clearly talks about in section 5.5, personal budgets and access to respite care or short breaks for children and young people with EHC plans. So this is the detail that's taken from that section of the guidance. So it talks about the fact that for children and young people with an EHC plan, the duties relating to personal budgets remain in place, as detailed in the SEND Code of Practice, that a child's parent or a young person has the right to request a personal budget when the local authority has completed an EHC needs assessment and confirmed that it will prepare a plan, and that they may also request a personal budget during a statutory review of a plan. And we know that those things are anticipated to go ahead as planned. So then in terms of services for disabled children provided under Section 17 of the Children Act 1989, these would typically include short breaks for parent carers. So the local authority remains under a duty to provide these. And although it's recognised that that may be challenging during the coronavirus outbreak, local authorities are to ensure that every effort is made to continue to provide this important support for families who need it. Where it's not possible for local authorities to arrange respite care for families as a result of circumstances related to coronavirus, then parents and carers and young people are encouraged to discuss that with the local authority, agree what alternative arrangements can be made. And that could include, so for example, local authorities considering whether making a personal budget or a direct payment available on a temporary basis might enable the family to secure alternative arrangements. Now, inevitably, I'm sure many of you are aware of the challenges that exist around direct payments and personal budgets for families. We know that actually even in normal times, it can be quite challenging for families to secure the support that they need for short break provision through direct payments. And actually at a time when there are far more limits on the access to the community, that inevitably is likely to be more challenging. So what we've really been trying to do at CDC in our work with the department through our role as strategic reform partner is to really understand what is happening out there, what areas and what services are managing to provide. So as part of that, We've been exploring any conflicts that have been raised to us in the guidance. And so this is one of the big challenges that has come out of that kind of exploration of the guidance and some of the questions that have been raised through our FAQs. So this was the actions for schools during the coronavirus outbreak guidance, which at 24.4 talked about whether the phased reopening would apply to out of school settings. So what this explains is that whilst at the time schools were preparing to welcome back some of their pupils on a phased basis from the 1st of June, this is not the case for out of school settings. And it explains here what out of school settings covers, which seems to include many of the community activities, clubs and holiday clubs that may have been providing short breaks. So this is something that we're in conversations with the department about at the moment, and we're thinking about how to unpick some of this guidance and look at what we need to do in terms of supporting families to access the short break provision that they need. Now, these types of out of school settings are potentially only one aspect of the whole myriad of different types of short breaks support that would be available in normal circumstances. So some of this work is about understanding what it is that we can think about and do differently that fits within the guidance that we've got available, and in order to fit within the kind of individual risk assessment approaches that we're using in other settings. So whether that's about returning to school, whether that's about engaging with the community for exercise, it's about thinking through what are the things that can be done differently within the constraints of the guidance that we currently have, and in order to ensure that we're making individual decisions for individual children on the basis of their needs. So a few of the example things to think about, which actually are examples in the guidance about, EHC provision outside of just social care and short breaks, but essentially are really relevant in the same context. So, what can we do differently? What might be different? Where might the new provision take place? How might new provision take place? So is it online? Is it in smaller groups? How can we follow social distancing rules, and what does that look like? When might the provision take place? So it might happen more or less or at a different time of day. And who might carry it out? It might be a different person to normal. And here we're talking about learning assistants instead of specialist therapists. But in terms of short breaks provision, we've heard some examples of where actually wider family members are being engaged in direct payment support and things like that, which actually previously we may not have done in the same way. So what are the actual practice implications and what are areas doing? So we've done some research in terms of the impact on short break. Now, it was a very quick turnaround piece of work to gather some evidence for DfE in order to inform some of their next steps around planning for short breaks. So this just summarises a little bit of the people that we spoke to. So we had feedback from 13 SENDIAS services. We analysed 54 of the emails that we received to our CDC FAQs email inbox. We had a survey which was not yet closed around CDC members and the impact it was having on them delivering their services. Some detailed feedback and interviews with local authority, disabled children's social work teams, short break teams and commissioners. 11 local offer reps responded via the local offer network. We had feedback from the Disabled Children's Partnerships survey, which we've heard mentioned earlier, and also feedback from kids in terms of the service provision that their services were able to make. And so initially what we'd found was that 55% of the providers responding to our survey had been able to continue to deliver only between 26 to 50% of their normal services. 28% of providers have been able to continue to deliver between 51 to 75% of their normal services, and 17% of providers have been able to continue to deliver almost all of their normal services. And often the difference there essentially is organisations which are essentially providing advice and information to families versus organisations that are providing direct support to children and young people in terms of short break provision. So some of the examples that have been shared with us, though, in terms of looking at alternative approaches, so if we start with the kind of direct payments option, so what has been happening differently in some areas is the flexibility around the way that direct payments have been able to be used. So actually some areas are working with families in order to support them to use direct payments differently based on individual needs. So thinking about whether sensory equipment can be purchased for in the home or the garden, thinking about activity equipment, so trampolines, bikes, garden games, but also then thinking about those families who perhaps don't have access to open space in the same way, and thinking about craft, arts, activities, things that that children and young people are able to engage with at home. And similarly then thinking about provision of computer devices, tablets, iPads, things that can support children and young people to engage with something more independently, whilst family are able to kind of do other things. We've then got some group activity stuff. Now, this inevitably has been much more challenging during the pandemic, as I'm sure you're all experiencing in your own day-to-day work. So some really interesting things that have been happening. We've got one area who've been in touch with us, and we're developing some learning examples with them at the moment, who have reduced and changed the model of their short break service. So one of the things that they did in order to start establishing how to operate in the pandemic was that they very early on conducted some really detailed analysis and RAG rated the top 30 children across each. So it's a by borough, so across each of the authority areas, RAG rated the top 30 children in each area who they felt were at significant, were likely to have significant needs in terms of support during the pandemic, were unlikely to be able to engage with school, and who were likely to need, whose families were likely to struggle. And actually, as part of this, they were identified and they worked quite quickly in order to open settings, for example, in special schools where the facilities weren't being used, or in other community settings. So a number of these areas are areas that are fortunate enough to have in-house provision for disabled children and young people, and open them with significantly reduced numbers. So, for example, 4 children and 4 support workers in a setting that would previously have been for maybe 20 to 30 children and young people at a time, but to split the sessions down. So instead of having, 20 to 30 children for a full day at a time, they're splitting the sessions into 3-hour sessions, having 4 children in each session twice a day, keeping workers and children in bubbles of support. And then in other areas, there's a specialist playground, which was part of a special school outside setting, where they have been enabling families to book the playground for an hour, having specialist cleaners on site. It's booked by one family at a time. It's then cleaned and disinfected thoroughly before the next family comes on, and enabling some of those things to happen in a way that it enables social distancing, and even in some circumstances enables shielding within a household to continue. So we've then got online activities, and I think we've heard mixed feedback about some of these. I think they've been one of the easiest things to adapt and deliver, but have been really challenging in some circumstances for families. It can often require a lot of support for children and young people to be engaged in those online activities, so it doesn't necessarily deliver the same level of break that some of the other things can do. So there's a lot more to think about there in terms of next steps around these things. So what I'd like to do now, we've got about 19 minutes left of this session before you've got a short break. It would be really great. I'm going to come out of this screen now so that I can actually see the chat messages, because I don't know if people have been posting anything while I've been on here, and just check if there are any questions or anything to pick up. But it would be great if any of you have any examples that you would be happy to share, to talk about, or that you'd be willing to share with colleagues, to think about actually what it is that happens, that's happening in your local area, what have been the challenges and what have been some of the successes in terms of delivering short breaks at the moment. Okay, is there anyone who'd like to share something? If you want to either just pop in the chat that you'd like to share something, or raise a hand. We're a relatively small group. Hopefully I'll be able to spot if any hands are up. Okay, Julie, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll share some of what we've been doing in Wakefield, but my main issue in terms of the presentation is about the group work. My understanding, and I've checked numerous times with the DFE, is that you can't mix children that are not already from the same family or not already in a particular bubble in schools. So I don't understand how the group work could go on that basis.
So I think, just to respond to that, I think the particular groups of children that they're talking about there were children that weren't accessing school at the time. So they weren't already part of a school bubble. And I agree that is something that's been raised to us as well. And we're currently working with the department. So the next steps around this are that we've asked the department to review the guidance around the kind of social care guidance that's saying short break should still be happening, the guidance around not opening out of school provision, which is saying that it shouldn't happen, to understand actually what the implications of that are for short breaks and how we can clarify some of those issues. And we're hoping that that will be, that is something we're working very closely on with developing them at the moment. As part of that, we as CDC have been asked to put out a call for evidence and information from areas who are currently delivering short breaks in any format, to look for examples of what is working for families, to understand how we can marry up that practice with what's happening in the guidance. So there will be something that will be coming out in the coming weeks. I don't have an exact timeline for it yet, Julie, but I will make sure that everyone is aware of it as soon as it's ready to go. And if anyone on this group is interested in sharing some examples as part of that, my colleague Emma's on this call, so she'll be happy to share the learning example template with everyone after the session, if anyone's got anything they'd like to share as part of that.
Whilst that's useful, we're heading into the summer holidays, and if we don't get information quick about who you can mix with, and my understanding still with the guidance was that if you're not in the same kind of group of families, you still cannot mix, certainly not till recently, about group work. So I am a little bit confused. If we don't get information out fairly quickly, it won't be possible to run groups during the summer, because they do take quite a lot of organising and arranging. And we're desperate to do that, but we do need the authorisation to kind of go ahead with that. In terms of short breaks in Wakefield, we've been still doing overnights. We did a reduced services of overnights. We did prioritise, like somebody has already said. We have had slots within playgrounds, equipment, and for some children and young people, we've opened up school playgrounds as well at a particular time slot for them to go in. We've used the budget very creatively, I think, in Wakefield. So we've bought garden equipment for those that are shielding. I bought Netflix vouchers. We've done takeaway vouchers in terms of, and we've been flexible about, in some cases allowing family members to do the kind of PA work around individual children and young people. So we've got a whole host of things going on, but we know that what we're doing at the moment is not really promoting the social aspect, which a lot of the children and young people are struggling with. And that's why I'm really keen and passionate to get kind of clarification about the group work, really.
Okay, thanks, Julie. That's really helpful. It's definitely something that we'll be taking back again after this session. So I will make sure that in the next conversations we have with the department, we're really reiterating the urgency of decisions around this and the urgency of guidance to go out to support people to prepare for the holidays. Did anyone else want to share anything? Anyone who's posted anything in the chat, you're welcome to speak and share your thoughts. I can see there's a lot of kind of questions coming up in the chat box, just kind of essentially reflecting the same things, the real challenge of the bubbles and understanding that. And I think, I think inevitably you're right that it's all very well to be kind of anticipating an announcement at some point in the future, but actually in terms of that planning, it needs to happen now. And particularly if planning is needing to happen around either trying to match bubbles for children who may have been in a particular bubble within school settings, or otherwise, that's something that needs to happen as a matter of urgency. Has anyone got any suggestions about how they could see that potentially could work in terms of planning, or any thoughts about
Caroline, can I share something that we've been doing in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough? It's more for the children with complex health needs. So we've worked with our local authority colleagues to look at, we know we've got a reduced overnight short break provision because of the environment and also the staff groups available within the local authority overnight short breaks. And in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, we the CCG grant funds into the overnight short breaks to support the health needs of children. We know that we've got families who are shielding and their children have very complex health needs, but we have children with continuing care needs, and their care packages have largely continued, and we've worked with families to think of flexible ways to continue to deliver those continuing care packages. But we're also really aware that some of the families that are shielding, especially our single parent families, are really beginning to struggle now, and they are some of them are at breaking point. So we've worked with our local authority to produce a pathway for a clinical care pathway, and CCG's funded some additional, funded a business plan with our local hospice. So we've created, we try not to call it a hospice to not put people off, but we've created the Each Milton Hub, and that hub will be able to provide support for families without having to go through a sort of continuing care assessment process. We've got a fast track continuing care assessment just for audit purposes, but in that way we can actually provide some respite and overnight provision for children that wouldn't necessarily either go to our local authority overnight short break provision because they have other care packages in place, or where families prefer a more kind of health sort of nurse-led service. So that's we're just literally in a mobilisation phase of that at the moment, but that's been a really lovely piece of work with the local authority, and we're just hoping that over the next 6 months that the families that have expressed the real need for something that's not going back to normal, really taking into account their fears around their shielded children and keeping them clinically safe, and making sure that they get some sort of break.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. It would be good to hear some more about how you've developed that, Siobhan, if it was possible to if you were happy to share some of that with us as part of the work that we're doing. That's brilliant. Yeah. I've got a few hands up now, so I'm going to go to Zara first, and then to Lisa, and then Julie. Have you got your hands up again, or is it still up from earlier? But either way, happy to come to you afterwards. So Zara, did you want to go ahead now?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. So there's conversations ongoing around the use of school facilities or the use of school staff and utilising school bubbles. Locally, we've had the local authority quite clearly reiterate that this is optional for schools, and that there is absolutely no expectation for schools to open up any holiday time provision or anything like that, which is great in the sense of schools, if they need a break, can have a break. But when we're looking at the access to short breaks and providing that support, the ideal scenario is that we maintain the school social bubble system, because that is what inevitably is going to be in place from September, whether it be the same as it is now or slightly adapted. Inevitably, it will be a social bubble system. We have had an example where the special school in our area actually utilised the local residential short breaks provider, who actually closed down their facility for a short period of time until we figured out what was going on. And they were going into the school setting and using those school bubbles as a way of delivering the respite care and the support that those children were usually getting. And they increased the offer to children who hadn't been assessed for those services but were clearly in need of that. If we can find a way of replicating that, that would be great. But I think this clarity around what the social bubble system is going to look like in schools moving forward will give providers a better idea of how they can utilise that, but also having a conversation with the local school systems around who are open, who are willing to support and enable and facilitate some sort of short break system. Another observation that I'd like to make, if I can, is around the guidance that came out a couple of weeks ago around the access to activities and leisure facilities, and how things are slowly going to change around outdoor activity spaces. And I'm really mindful that short breaks providers could potentially tap into and develop relationships with providers who have more expansive outdoor space that they could use in more socially acceptable distancing and all that sort of stuff. But where does that actually sit legally with the guidance for the providers themselves? Because looking at the two different sets of guidance, they could overlap and marry quite beautifully, but actually from a legal stance, would providers be held to account in breach of, because they're utilising guidance that isn't necessarily written for them to be able to deliver their services more effectively and more creatively?
And I think that's a really helpful point, Zara. So one of the things that we have gone back to, and one of the things that we're working on the department with at the moment, and one of the first things we said when the kind of reopening of schools guidance came out, was that actually there are two challenges around delivering short breaks at the moment. One is around providers' confidence in knowing how and when to reopen and how to keep children and their staff and others safe. And the other is around parental confidence in supporting their children back into those environments and having that confidence that their children are safe and cared for in the way that the guidance says that they need to be. So I think what we are, our ask of the department at the moment, and what we hope that they're working towards, is something that brings together all the other pieces of guidance and explains for local authorities and short break providers how that guidance needs to be interpreted in the context of reopening short breaks, and what the examples are that we can find nationally that might support people to do things in a different way. And I think thinking about where things have been done differently that people feel could actually have some benefit and some long-term impact beyond the kind of pandemic and beyond reopening and social distancing, and actually how can we maintain some of the things that have worked well. And some of the things have been mentioned by both yourself and Siobhan, which have also been around process, which is actually speeding up decision making and risk assessment around who are the people that need this most, opening up services where possible to families that may not previously have been eligible under systems that were in place pre-COVID, but also I think really ensuring that both providers and parents have that confidence to be able to start to re-engage in things in the right way. And that is absolutely what we are pushing for and working with the department on developing at the moment, and working across the sector to try and get some of that other kind of support and feedback. Okay, so can I come to Lisa Taylor now, please? You've got your hands up.
Hi. Yeah, so basically for me, it's around the lack of guidance in relation to the bubble. The providers that we're working with currently in Lancashire are keen to start to resume some of those services. And what we have looked at is small groups, so we can enable more sessions a day in these bubbles, but we're not getting any guidance as such. One, when we're anticipating getting that guidance, because if it isn't going to work for us, then we're not going to have very much time to think flexibly in terms of meeting some of these vulnerable children's needs over the summer. So things like Netflix vouchers, access to an hour, school equipment will be fantastic. But my worry is schools are going to close, and we're going to have buildings and equipment that isn't going to be available, and families just sat at home, not knowing what's happening.
Yeah, I think they're all really valid concerns, and actually, to be honest, Lisa, I think almost what I would seek to do is request from all of you to say, when do we need this guidance? What is the latest that this can happen for anything to work over the summer, and that we need to then go back and feed that in to the department? Because actually, as you say, it's no good us working for the next 3 weeks on publishing something that doesn't give anyone any time to plan for anything. So I think it's really important to understand from you as part of this session, when are we talking about, and how are there things that perhaps we could pull together now out of guidance that exists to say these are some things that definitely can happen, but also the point is understood that actually the key issue here is about group sessions, group support, socialisation for children and young people that have been missing that for a long time now, and understanding how we can scale up anything that has been done within the constraints of the guidance at this time.
See, because what we're literally in the process of doing at the moment is we're putting together a bit of a snappy survey going out to parents next week in terms of understanding the impact COVID's had on them, and what their confidence levels are to actually understand demand. We operate a short break service to hundreds and hundreds of children, and if we get a really positive response, and I'm sure we will, and I'm sure we've probably got even more children and young people that need it who've never accessed the service. But I feel if we're doing that, we're already putting parents, we're getting them ready to looking at delivering a service, but we might not actually deliver that service. So I'm concerned about that really, that we're going to be putting families' hopes up. We're going to be offering possibly a 2-hour break. It's not a lot, but it's more than what these children have had since lockdown 23rd of March. So anything will be greatly appreciated.
Okay, we'll definitely make sure that message goes back in loud and clear. Thank you, Lisa. So I've got hands up from Jessica Moore now. Jessica, would you like to share?
Yeah, it was just to reiterate those comments that Lisa's just made, but also just in terms of what we're doing in Sunderland. We've done our survey with parents and carers, and they've clearly said that whilst there's some reticence about group-based sessions, that for those children with particularly complex needs, they really feel that they need something like that over the summer, because that, you know, Netflix vouchers and all that we can do, but families are clearly saying to us that they need something else over the summer, and that the lack of clarity is actually causing both them and their children some great anxiety. So really, in answer to your question about timescales, I think somebody in the chat said last month would have been ideal. I think just to agree with that, we need it as soon as possible.
So I think what's really helpful about this session is being able to pull out some of the significant impact that the delay to guidance is having, not only on providers and planning and local authorities in terms of commissioning services for the summer, but also in terms of the impact on families and children and young people about understanding what's going to be expected and how to plan for themselves for the summer, and to have that confidence that there may be support available. I'm conscious of the time, so if there's anyone else who's got a final comment, I'm very happy to take one last comment before the break. But just to reassure everyone, everything that's been talked about today will be collated and fed back into the department as part of the work that we're doing with them on this, and to really kind of stress the vital urgency around getting out some messages around this as soon as possible. Okay. Right, I'll let you guys go. I think there's a 10-minute kind of tea or coffee break. Sorry we can't provide for you on this occasion, but please do take 10-minute comfort break, and then the next workshop starts at 3:50. So you should have all your log-ons for that. It's been great to speak to everyone. Thank you for your time today, and we will also make sure that all of the presentation slides and information goes out to everyone after the session. Thanks very much, everybody.
Caroline, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm going to stop. I can't hear you. I'm just going to stop recording now. Okay, and go into the next one.